This is my new Patreon series number 18. We're going to look at Yeshua's teachings on non-dualism and self-liberation. This is part one. In this part, we're going to look at the roots in Jewish wisdom traditions that Yeshua built upon for his concepts. I call these Yeshua's teachings on spiritual reintegration. They were based on two principles in his halakha of spiritual rebirth. The Jewish wisdom school ideal of a son of God, or tzaddik, or Jewish saint who is tam, perfect, or shalem, whole, which we will go into very much on this in this part as we discuss what this ideal was, and Yeshua's unique halakha of individual moral, spiritual self-regeneration into the bar anash, or eternal Adam Kadmon, or assembly or body of Christ, to realize the messianic Malkuth on earth. This is a kabbalistic diagram that came from a later period, but the original Adam, Adam Kadmon, is not the Adam who is divided into Adam and Eve. The Adam who is divided into Adam and Eve was considered to be the first incarnate Adam who fell from the Garden of Paradise, or the third heaven. This is the primordial human being, the primordial Adam, Adam Kadmon, who is known as the eternal Christ in the earliest Christian writings and epistles. And even though we talk about the Baranash as a new humanity, it's really humanity that has been reintegrated back into the original divine humanity as it existed in the beginning with the Abba. Now, biblical scholars generally understand Yeshua's halakha as a higher ethical standard for the purpose of purifying disciples and making them worthy to enter the messianic age, whose advent was being proclaimed by Yeshua. Now, we know from that period of time, from the Qumran documents, what the Essene standards for priests, which were applied to all members. Every member was considered to be a priest and had to follow the standards in the Torah for priests. And therefore, they had to avoid things that were unclean, dead bodies, all kinds of other things, and follow a higher ethical standard than basic Pharisaic Judaism would prescribe for people. Yeshua's standards were not the Essene standards, which were very exclusive and very much based on ritual Torah and so on, but the prophetic or Galilean standards that we find taught among other sages, even from Nazareth, that we'll discuss. And these are essentially developed out of the philosophical evolution of prophetic ideals of what purity were. You know that Paul says in his epistles, "You are a holy priesthood." Well, he's not referring to the Essene idea of ritual purity. He's referring to the idea that every Christian must become a saint, must become a tzaddik. But there are several authentic Devarim and Mashalim preserved in the Gospel of Thomas and other so-called Gnostic texts that reveal that Yeshua's halakha was similar to classic Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, and other Eastern teachings for achieving a non-dualistic state of self-realization and enlightened living. Here I've put up on the screen a book showing the parallel sayings of Yeshua and Buddha and Krishna and Lao Tzu and so on. This is a treasury of human wisdom that has come through many, many traditions. That is why theosophy became such an important thing 100, 150 years ago. The idea of the religions of mankind having, at their highest peak, similarities, similar wisdom, and so on. And that, in fact, we find exists when we study the deeper aspects of the teachings of Yeshua. They are not just Jewish, and we'll discuss why that's so. Buddhologists such as Edward Kanza and Gnostic scholars like Elaine Pagels agree upon all these similarities, and I've given you a link here if you want to look at the relationship between Buddhism and Gnosticism. These relationships were not preserved in normal Christian, or what we call proto-orthodox Christian teaching, in any recognizable way. They were not developed later by the Gnostics, but the Gnostics actually brought forward some of the original kabbalistic ideas of Yeshua that were later called Gnostic, or they were turned into Gnostic ideas. And these ideas are based on the Jewish wisdom tradition. So I and other scholars have shown that many so-called Gnostic Jesus traditions derive from authentic teachings of Yeshua. Here's my book, The Kabbalistic Words of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, a complete translation and explanation of each of the sayings, each of the logoi in the Gospel of Thomas, and distinguishing the authentic ones based on Aramaic sayings of Yeshua, probably from about the same period of time as the Q document, from the later ones that were composed by Gnostics, and recovering them. About 80% of these sayings are authentic. However, the similarities to Hindu, Buddhist, and other Eastern teaching derive from Jewish wisdom schools and Kabbalistic midrash during the Hellenistic period. During the Hellenistic period, there was all kinds of contact between in Babylon, in Alexandria, and among all the diaspora Jews, because the Jews have been driven out of their own homeland, and all the educated people taken to Babylon, and other people had settled elsewhere in the diaspora, and they came into contact with other traditions. So there were the gymnosophists of Alexandria, that is the naked philosophers, or the Brahmins, who had a colony near Alexandria. There were the conquests that had been made by Ashoka, where he imposed Buddhism upon people in India and what we today call Afghanistan, places very close to Babylon, where there was trade along the Silk Road and so on. All kinds of intermixing of information and traditions. The first book of Genesis in the Old Testament is a retelling in Jewish terms of the creation story of the Babylonians, which was a 7-day story. The world is created in 7 primordial days, but not by just one God, but by a council of gods who emitted light, and it goes in the same sequence and so on. So we know that from the get-go, the Jewish priesthood was separating itself by contrasting itself and its ideas to those of its own existing environment, that is the Zoroastrians, the Zoroastrian priesthood in Babylon. And that is why we have the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And there are many, many, many other examples of the ways in which the Jewish sages interacted with and against, and were influenced by, or influenced to develop a counter doctrine to deal with existing ideas in the Hellenistic culture, which were some of them that were most important, probably, and most influential on the Jewish sages were those of the Pythagoreans, out of which the Jewish Kabbalah, the idea of the creation of the universe through the Hebrew letters and a whole number letter mysticism, was a development that happened after the Pythagoreans had developed the same thing for Greek letters and Greek letter number mysticism and so on. So that the Jewish sages were influenced very much by their Hellenistic and cosmopolitan environment. And that is why we have similarities to Hindu, Buddhist, and other Eastern teaching in the Jewish wisdom schools. For example, I might mention Koheleth, Ecclesiastes, who talks in the terrible translations of the King James Bible, he talks of vanity, vanity, all is a vanity. The word is hebel, hebel, hebel. It doesn't mean vanity like we mean. It means illusion, smoke and mirrors. The human view of reality is a virtual reality that's not really true, that we see with illusion. It's Maya. And so these concepts are influencing how Jewish wisdom develops alongside Vedic wisdom and alongside Hebrew or Jewish, or rather Greek philosophers, and so on. That's in the ancient world, the Hellenistic world was a place where there was all kinds of syncretism and mixtures that occurred. Note that Hellenistic Jewish Midrash had several points of contact also with Buddhist and Hindu thought. In Alexandria, I mentioned the Gymnosophists, in Babylon, with Buddhism and other diaspora communities. And so we have Hinduism and Buddhism actually in physical contact and in communities dwelling next to and near. And we should also say in Egypt, the last developments of the Egyptian priesthood, which were the Hermetic, or the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus. All of these things were in the environment that this kind of wisdom developed. And Jewish scholars like Sholem have shown the influence of Pythagorean and other Hellenistic philosophy on Jewish thought during this intertestamental period. So in part one, we're going to examine the intertestamental Jewish concepts from which Yeshua derived and developed his halakha of spiritual self-regeneration or rebirth. Probably the most important concept that guided a lot of the ideas of Yeshua about purity and sanctification were the ideas of the good and evil yetzerim, or the inclinations of the heart, the two creations, the divine creation and the infernal creation. Yeshua taught a halakha of self-liberation from the consequences, or hub, of sin, which is called hata, and that these consequences of sin are kind of like what in the East we call karma. And he taught a halakha of self-liberation from these consequences that would mitigate them, but would not make them vanish, in order to achieve moral, spiritual purity for the Messianic age. The new humanity needed to liberate itself from the consequences and the web of sin that it had spun for itself over ages. Now, that is not something that could be wiped out of existence. It just exists in reality, these consequences. However, it is something from which they can be extricated and for which there can be a great deal of mitigation of the consequences. So he framed this in terms of moral self-transformation from a state of human duality to one of divine non-duality based on his unique interpretation of existing Jewish midrash, which, as I say, was deeply influenced by other traditions. In Johannine, an Alexandrian and Gnostic Christology that developed later, this evolved into concepts of spiritual rebirth or palingenesis, as we find in John's Gospel, and kabbalistic marriage or unification with Godhead through the mediation of the divine Redeemer, Lord Christ, and all kinds of other things. But the initiatic teachings of Yeshua were more closely related to Pythagorean, Buddhist, and Hindu ideals of self-liberation from illusion, ignorance, and the operations of karma, and the archons that Paul talks about, under whose influence we are all bound to operate, or hymarmene, destiny. Hymarmene is the operation that is at the root of for the concepts of natal astrology and horary astrology and so on that developed in the Hellenistic period, both in the West and in the East. Now, several centuries before the birth of Yeshua, Jewish sages had developed a theodicy derived from Genesis 2.7 to explain why moral evil exists in a universe that was formed, emanated, or created, is the word we're used to hearing, by a good God, Yahweh Elohim. How can evil exist in a world emanated by a good deity? A theodicy is an explanation for the existence of evil in the world. And this theodicy was based on the idea of two creations, two Yetzerim, two formations. And the actual Jewish word means formation, the Hebrew word. The two formations, the two Yetzerim. And this explains the dual nature that exists in the heart of human beings. Now, the most ancient Hebrew texts of Genesis show a spelling anomaly that's purposely written into Genesis 2.7 for the word Yetzer in the phrase, the Lord God, the Yahweh Elohim, formed Yetzer, the Adam, humanity man, from the clay of the earth. Here we have the word Yetzer, but the word has an extra yod, two yods. The spelling with a double yod reflected a midrashic teaching that evil existed not in the divine creation, but as a necessary duality in the human heart that manifested through the fact that the non-dual reality of Godhead and the heavens emanated it itself into existence and manifestation, and that was necessarily dualistic. So we have a good Yetzer, which is the good inclination or spirit or impulse, and the evil Yetzer that are formed in the human heart at the formation of Adam. Now, Godhead is one, and this is a very important concept. It's not just that there is only one God concept, because in more ancient Hebrew religion, the Yahweh was the national God. He was just the highest God. He was El Elyon, but he was not the only God. There were all kinds of gods, and they eventually came out as archangels and things like this in these traditions. But the idea of Godhead as one, as unity, is expressed in the idea that all the beings of the heavenly eternities, or the Shemayim, are non-dual. Therefore, they're androgynous, like the angels. They're complete, they're whole, they're shalem, they're tam, perfect. But human consciousness, which it resides in what is called the heart, the lab, which is what the consciousness of the mind, or what in the Greek would be the suke, the psyche. The human consciousness manifests in a state of moral duality, a natural consequence of emanation into dualistic reality, or through creation or formation. We might simply characterize this idea of the good Yetzer and the evil Yetzer, the good creation, the evil creation, the two impulses of the heart, as those that are selfless and selfish. Now, rabbis have already interpreted this idea of humans existing in a state of more moral duality as God's gift of free will, the opportunity to choose between the good and the evil, so that humanity can choose good over evil and become sons of God, the goal of Yeshua's Hanukkah. Not that they do. Now you can review my Patreon series number 2 concerning the Abba and the ancient Midrashic theodicy on the emanation or creation of the worlds in the first chapter of Genesis. The doctrine of the good and evil Yetzer was taught to every Jewish boy when he learned to read scripture for his bar mitzvah, because there were no vowels included at that time. The vowels were added centuries later. They were just a whole string of consonants, and you had to learn how to sing or intone and pronounce them and what they meant. And when the Jewish boy would come upon the word Yetzer with 2 yods, he would ask, why are there 2 yods? This word should only have 1 yod. And that's how this was explained. Yeshua would have learned this at age 12 or 13 or earlier. It's still a basic doctrine of Judaism. So let's take a look at the 2 Yetzerim, the formation or theodicy of the dual nature of the heart. The good Yetzer and the evil Yetzer, the good impulse and the evil impulse. Selfless versus selfish. In the Deuteronomic concept of the 2 ways doctrine, the way of life and the way of death, there was developed a duality between good and evil. A lot of scholars used to observe that this occurred during the time of the diaspora in Babylon, when people came in contact with the Zoroastrian ideas, and the Zoroastrians had a very dualistic concept of 2 deities and a good universe and an evil universe. Then the good would eventually overthrow the evil, but all things were set off in good and evil ways. And this developed in Judaism as the concept of the 2 ways doctrines that were known as the way of life and the way of death. I set before you the way of life and the way of death. You choose. And we learn the kind of terms that are used in the intertestamental period to describe this idea are what they call the spirit of truth, which is from the abode of light, and the prince of lights and the angel of truth, and the spirit of error, which is from the source of darkness, or the angels of darkness. And this is the period of time when the concept of angelology and demonology began to develop in Judaism. Both of these shine in the heart of man. The counsels of the spirit of truth are the spirit of humility, slowness to anger, great compassion, eternal goodness, zeal, holy thoughts. Notice that one of them is concealing the truth of the mysteries, not revealing the things that should not be revealed. And the counsels of the spirit of error include greediness, slackness of hands in service of righteousness, wickedness, falsehood, pride, etc., etc. Moral blindness, hardness of heart, cunning, and all this sort of thing. The kabbalistic concept of divine and infernal inclinations of the heart should be summarized then and fully understood, just so we proceed with this understanding. It's a development of the Deuteronomic 2 ways doctrine. Deuteronomy was probably written in the century before the exile, before the 6th century. The 2 ways doctrines, the dualistic way of life and the way of death, the choice that must be made. It evolved then during the diaspora and during the captivity into a kabbalistic theodicy. And a theodicy is an explanation for the existence of evil in a good world that was manifested into existence by a good and perfect Godhead. And that's because the Jewish sages were now had to confront the questions that were asked by other philosophers. Why is there evil in the world? And the doctrine of the good and evil Yetzer was well established long before the time of Yeshua, and definitely a part of his basic concept of religious and spiritual concept. In the most ancient texts, again, we will say that we find the most ancient text of the Hebrew Old Testament from the 2nd century BC, which we find in the texts in Qumran and other places. The word Yetzer, or formed or constructed, which we translate as created, in the Genesis creation story, 2:7, about the construction of Adam, or the formation of Adam, is altered to Yetzer with 2 yods to indicate the kabbalistic interpretation. Now, scholars have argued over what came first, the Yetzer, and then people try to explain it. It was some kind of a spelling error or an anomaly of spelling. Or was it that when the texts were copied, this word, Yetzer, was given an extra yod in this one place in order to indicate this doctrine? And to me, it seems quite obvious that that is what happened, that this was consciously inserted into the text and became a basic part of how that text was understood. And remember that the first chapter of Genesis has become the touchstone for all Kabbalistic cosmology. So here we have the word that should be Yetzer. It has been turned into Yetzer, 2 yods. And that is something would be read by every young Jewish boy preparing for his bar mitzvah. So every heart contains both the good and evil impulses, or spirits, as they're very often called. The Yetzer HaTov, which is rooted in the Zelem, or image of Godhead, and the Yetzer HaRa, or evil impulse, which is the necessary negative reaction to creation or emanation in a dualistic universe. Because all reality is dualistic, action and reaction. It's allegorized as the klippot, or the shattered shells of the sephirot, when they are shattered in order to cause the divine qualities of Godhead to interact and intercommunicate with each other and become a system. And when that begins, time starts. And when time starts, past and present and future begin, and the dualistic universe appears. And so this is embedded in our dualistic human nature. And that explains that the evil is not because God is good, but in order to have a creation, in order to have manifestation, it is necessary that there be reaction as well as action, and evil as well as good, shadow as well as light. For Yeshua, the work of spiritual sanctification then was to be guided by the good inclination or motivation or spirit, and to reject the evil inclination or motivation, which is understood as spirits. They were both understood as spirits, and eventually, as we'll see, they were developed into a whole system, 7-fold, actually 8-fold spirits of the good and evil inclinations. In Kabbalistic congregations of Jews today, they still have a special prayer for God to protect them from the attacks of the evil Yetzer and so on. So the work of spiritual sanctification was to be done by the individual person by following the good inclination of the right motivation, and that would be the selfless motivation, the selfless spirit, rather than selfish spirit. And this was the only valid basis then, in Yeshua's view, for ritual purification. Yes, you do ritual purifications, you do mikvah, you do whatever, but if your heart isn't in the right place, if you don't have the right motivation, the rituals are useless. They're without merit. A younger Galilean sage, also from Nazareth, and also in agreement with the school of Shammai and with Yeshua about many halakhic rulings, was named Eleazar ben Hyrcanus. Uh, he was a disciple of Ben Zakkai, but considered to be one of the most brilliant. And he, like Yeshua, opposed the Judean Pharisaic ritualistic halakha, which he called the teachings of men and not of God, and would have agreed with Yeshua about what the root of purity was, that it came from the heart. It came from within, and that was the most important thing. External rituals could not purify anything. And that's why Yeshua stressed self-examination of motives and declared that it is thoughts and actions and not mere external ritual that either purify or defile the neshama, the soul. It's what you do in life. After you're dead, you can't make any differences. As Yeshua said, when the night comes, no one can work. But it's what we do in life, where the rubber meets the road in incarnation, that either purifies or defiles the soul.
The Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs contains important information from the Kabbalistic wisdom schools. It was written originally in Aramaic in the 1st century before the Christian era. And the Testament of Reuben is the one that we're really concerned about. He speaks about the 7 spirits in man. 7 are appointed against man and are leaders in the works of youth, and 7 are given at his creation for the good works of mankind. That is the image of God, the good Yetzer. Each is a duality. There are good and evil aspects to each of these impulses, these Yetzerim, and each has an aspect of the 8th spirit of trance, which in its good form is divine inspiration, and its evil form is delusion and dream.
Now here in this slide, I'm showing you the text of the Testament of Reuben, which is written 100 years before the time of Yeshua, part of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. I'm giving you a website so you can read it if you'd like, about the 7 spirits that are appointed against man, and they are leaders in the works of youth. You can read this whole thing. I'm not going to read it to you, and you can stop the video at this point in order to read all these things.
Now, if we relate the information we get in the Testament of Reuben to the Kabbalistic explanation of how the good and evil Yetzerim came into being, we find that the Yetzer HaTov, which is the divine spark or the image of God in the heart of every being and in humanity, or the good impulse, is rooted in the 7 spirits or sephirot, or intelligences, or senses of the divine image in the soul plus an 8th. The 7 spirits plus an 8th are the powers of the divine image, and they're related to the senses, not to the physical body. Knowledge is the first and primary, and then the life seed itself, which is a life force, and sight, which is psychic, and hearing, which is psychic, and smell, which is psychic, taste, speech, and love. That is the power of procreation. Now, in the creation of the 2 Yetzerim, as mankind is incarnated into flesh, these become dual in nature. The 8th is the source of divine revelation and the dayspring for the prophets, but also the source of dream and fantasy and delusion. And the life force is also the root of where the evils of injustice come from. Psychic sight becomes deceit, and spiritual teaching can become pride. Teaching is associated now, as you see, I'm associating these with the 7 chakras because they associate very well, and that's an interesting thing about the 7 spirits of the Testament of Reuben, is they associate in the physical body with the physical chakras. Discrimination can become inattention and ignorance. And the power of manifestation in the solar plexus can become the power of aggression. And the source of nourishment in the body can become gluttony, and the source of love can become lust.
Now let's look at a little more deeply at the concept of the evil Yetzer, the evil image, or the idea of evil that Yeshua was imbued with and was teaching out of. There is no Yetzer Hara, or evil impulse, in the divine image, which we later find expressed as the kabbalistic tree, although Yeshua did use a lot of tree language. So if we look at this diagram of the 32 paths of Genesis, this is the kabbalistic tree. This is what we call the unfallen tree, or the unprolapsed tree, the primordial tree, the primordial sephirot, or words of Godhead that are manifested. And when they are then connected, the containers that hold in each of these divine qualities, which are wisdom and compassion and so on, they are shattered so that the qualities can all communicate and operate, and time begins. And the shards, or broken pieces of the coverings that held these things separate and isolated, are now freed and become loose in the universe, and we now have good and evil. And this is the origin of evil. So there's no Yetzer Hara, or evil impulse, in the divine image, or the divine creation, or the divine formation. I am pointing out the three top parts of this tree, and this is, you will find this in the earliest Kabbalistic writings, the Sefer Yetzirah, which were contemporary with and actually much older than the time of Yeshua, and which Yeshua obviously used and knew because he used a lot of the terminology. This top is known as the supernal triad, and that corresponds to what we hear as the eighth spirit, because this is the divine part of humanity that is not incarnate in humanity. You might have noticed that the primordial man, Adam Kadmon, begins below this supernal triad. So this is the divine part. This is in my particular thing, I have it matched to tarot trumps, but I'm putting it here because it demonstrates a lot of things. The seven lower sephirot correspond to the dual sevenfold Yetzerim that will become part of the body and part of the incarnation. So when Adam, or Adam, humanity, is divided and given a coat of skin, and becomes incarnate and is driven out of Eden and is exiled, he becomes incarnate into physical flesh. The central column here prolapses, and these three lose touch with the supernal triad of Godhead. And that is a condition of man. Man in flesh is out of touch with Godhead and the supernal triad, and has to make the effort to reintegrate, to return to his primordial unity, his primordial walk with God in paradise. And human reality now becomes inverted, and the spirits, or sephiroth, become associated with organs like the stomach and the liver and so on. And so we get the seven spirits plus an eighth. And at this point, the sevenfold Yetzer Hara attaches as vampiric klipot, shards or husks of negative inverted energy rooted in the mortal nature of flesh, to influence and twist how the spirits express. In Yeshua's apocalyptic view, beginning with the first Adam, humanity has allowed itself to be ruled by the evil Yetzer. This is the dilemma. The self-caused fall or expulsion of Adam from paradise of the third heaven into physical incarnation is allegorized by the fall of Shaitan, Satan, and his evil angelic host into the fifth heaven in the Enochian system, where they have influenced humanity telepathically and through the force of their evil to enslave itself to evil inclinations and thus to hub the consequences or karma of sin. And this is the way they allegorize these development of Hebrew angelology and demonology, and the hosts of Shaitan or Satan are actually, many of them, given names of Babylonian gods and goddesses, which of course were considered to be lower beings, lower than the Elohim or the archangelic beings of the Abba. So now that divine Malkuth and the Messianic age is appearing on earth, as Yeshua says, Shaitan, Satan, also falls to earth for the final battles and trials and what was known in the Messianic ideas as the birth pangs of Messiah. In Yeshua's view, the coming of divine Malkuth or sovereignty and the coming of Messiah or the new humanity is the same event. So Shaitan, by the way, or Satan, is the adversary that Yeshua defeats in the legend of his 40-day trial in the wilderness, which is probably based on Peter's memory of an experience Yeshua recounted to his disciples of his own struggles with his own good and evil Yetzerim. Yeshua may have said, as we find in Luke 10:18, "In a vision I saw Shaitan fall from the heavens like lightning." It's another way of saying the struggle for humanity, the soul of humanity in the earth has begun because the Malkuth of God, the sovereignty of Godhead, and the Messiah, the Bar Enosh, are now have now drawn near and are even now appearing on earth in an advent of the new humanity and the new Messianic age. So let's take a look at Yeshua's teaching, some of them, about the good and evil inclinations of the heart. In the Q source, which is repeated in Matthew and Luke and in Papias, Yeshua says, "A good man out of the good treasury of the heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things." He says, "Grapes are not harvested from thorns, nor are figs gathered from thistles, for they do not produce fruit. A good man brings forth a good thing from his treasury, an evil man brings forth evil things from his evil treasury, which is in his heart, and says evil things, for out of the inclinations, or Yetzerim, of the heart, he brings forth evil." We find this in Thomas Logan 45, very authentic, probably more authentic than what we find in Q. Now, the Hebrew Aramaic word atzad, or for temple or treasury, is important. The heart, or lab, or labab, is the Egyptian loan word that comes across from Egyptian funerary philosophy for the physical organ considered to be the seat of consciousness and conscience. In Hebrew, it's the very same word in Hebrew as it was in Egyptian. And it is the place, the heart is the place where good and evil impulses from exercising good and evil Yetzerim are stored to accompany the neshama or soul after death for purification in Gehenna. We've discussed this more thoroughly in earlier presentations. Now, I have to, at this point, say something about Galilean prophetic Pharisaic doctrine as opposed to Judean. Yeshua was Galilean sage. he, like other sages from Galilee and later in Nazareth, like himself, as we mentioned Ben Hyrcanus and so on, they were not, did not feel that ritual was the source of purification. Ritual could be done with the right motivation, and then it could become a source of purification. You could fast with the right motivation, and it would be purifying. But if you just put on a show of fasting and put on sackcloth and ashes, that didn't purify you. That ritual did not do so. However, the Judean rabbis and Pharisees said, yes, it does. External ritual is the source of your purification, because it says in the Torah that in order to purify yourself, you do this. But Yeshua and the Galileans came from the older Israeli tradition, which was much in tune with the ideas of justice that were promulgated by the Jewish prophets, the earliest of which came from the northern kingdom, from Israel. Divine sanctification and purity, in this view, are achieved through actions rooted in the good intentions of the heart rather than mere external ritual. So this is the seat of one of the main ways that Yeshua attacked what in the Bible are just called the Pharisees, but they're actually the Judean Pharisees. When he's in Jerusalem around the temple, he attacks them for these kinds of things. It seems real obvious to Christians. Oh yeah, that's the way it is, because they have received and understood this teaching that divine sanctification are achieved through things one does that are based in the intentions and the good intentions of the heart and so on. We understand that, but that was not universally accepted at all, and in the among the Judean Pharisees, that was not considered to be true. So here we have another statement. And he, Yeshua, called the people to him and said to them, hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a man. He is talking about the idea of being defiled by eating certain foods, or by eating unkosher foods, or drinking unclean water and things like this. That does not defile the soul, and it does not defile the person. It is what comes out, what you put out from your own heart, that defiles him. Peter said to him, explain this davar to us. And he said, are you also still without understanding? Whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach, and so passes on. But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a man. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. We find this in the Gospels of Mark, which are probably taken from remembrances of Peter, and the Gospel of Matthew, which has a different Jesus tradition. This is not found in the Q sayings, but it's a separate Matthean Jesus tradition that seems to be quite authentic. What goes into your mouth will not defile you, but rather what comes out of your mouth, that is what will defile you. We find this in the Thomas Logian 14c. It's an authentic Semitic characteristic Logian from that was remembered probably in the AD 30s and passed on then through the Gospel of Thomas. So these are teachings about the good and evil inclinations of the heart. And there are many other examples that can be drawn. When you read through the teachings of Yeshua, you will understand what his frame of reference is. The meaning is that you sanctify or defile your soul by the intentions, selfish or selfless, that you choose to manifest, to bring into action and express in words and deeds. So the essential part of purification in order to be in the presence of God, because as the Messianic age uh, came into existence and as the new humanity uh, began to create itself here on earth, God's presence uh, uh, becomes real here on earth in a way that it hasn't been before in human consciousness. And therefore, the advent of the Messianic age and the coming of Messiah and so on must be prepared for. They must be received by purifying the heart, by doing what you can do to not express the fruits of the evil Yetzer. He has many warnings against what is called double-heartedness, and the Greek word is double soul, double mind. Uh, uh, Sukoi. And these warnings are found throughout the Hebrew Bible of Psalms and books composed after 200 BCE, when the doctrine of the two Yetzerim was current, as well as in the New Testament and other early Christian writings. For example, in the Psalms that were written, the later Psalms, create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Psalm 24, the one who has clean hands and a pure heart. Clean hands means his actions or activities are righteous. Psalm 119, I hate those who are double-hearted. Daisukoi is the term in Greek. Yeshua says, blessed are the pure in heart. To them is prepared a vision of God. And this is reconstructed from Papias and Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. The word oiantai, from horein, the Greek verb used by Paul, is used here to describe the resurrection visions of the disciples, and here now from Hebrew har and ra, used in this context to mean to see visions in a dream, as Daniel and the prophets had. So Yeshua is saying those who sanctify themselves, who purify themselves, make themselves into sons of God, to them they will receive the vision of God, just like Daniel did, and just like Joel says, your old men will see visions and dream dreams and so on. The early first century part of the Didache, this is the one that was written probably in about the same time as the Q source, chapter 5 warns against double-mindedness, which is a term we find in the Greek Gospels as daisukos, meaning double-souled. And this is meaning you cannot purify your heart as long as it remains double, as long as it remains dual. And Yeshua compared this to serving two masters, or riding two horses, or stringing two bows. You cannot do these things. In James, who undoubtedly transmits traditions of his brother Yeshua, although the book of James has been radically edited and spun in certain ways, but it still preserves some wonderful material. He says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Purify your hearts, you double-souled. Those of you who are still operating out of sincere and insincere motions, selfish and selfless motions, purify, become selfless. Yeshua's Aramaic terms for this were se'ef, which means divided, versus tam, which means perfect, like the Abba, or shalem, which meant whole and unified and integrated or at peace, and zaka, pure in heart, clean. And so Yeshua's idea of the dualistic nature of man in the universe was that it was se'ef, divided. And his concept of the whole, the unified version, the God is one, all things are one, was that it was tam, perfect. It was complete, whole, like the angels, and so on. So disciples must make themselves tam by allowing only the Yetzer HaTov to guide their intentions and their speech and their actions. Otherwise, if you are following it, sometimes the Yetzer HaTov and it's sometimes the Yetzer HaRa, you do not have a pure heart. You have a divided heart. You're a se'ef. You're a double soul, double-hearted, double-minded. So each person is responsible for his own personal intentions, speeches, and actions. So you can go out and do rituals, but if you do not have in your heart the proper motivation, the right motivation, the rituals are of no use. Yeshua tells the story of the two men go to pray at the wall, and the one man, who is a righteous man, he's a Pharisee, says, I thank you, God, that I am not as this man, because I give to charity and I do this and all that kind of stuff. And the tax collector, who was a sinner, came and said, God, have mercy upon me, I am a sinner. And he says, the second one, the sinner, came away justified. He came away with the right spirit. Even though the first man would appear to be socially the righteous man. The other one was the one who had made himself righteous. And that is why sinners and other kinds of people and poor people and so on, just on their own activities, by controlling and working within themselves in a tantric way, really, this is a way of understanding it, to be responsible for his own personal speech and intentions and actions, that is sanctifying. That is the most effective means of sanctifying and achieving the kind of purity necessary to have the vision of God, to be in the presence of God, and so on. Luke 17:1, Yeshua is quoted as having said, it is inevitable or necessary that offenses will come, that people will sin, that bad things will happen. But woe to those by whom they come. So the responsibility is personal. The responsibility for purifying the heart and sanctifying the self is up to the individual. And that is why the teachings of Yeshua are about practices that one adopts, and about observations and becoming aware of one's own intentions and trying to keep oneself in tune with the divine spirit that was within the heart, rather than following the other forces. So we're going to end this little part one that we've talked now about the main Jewish wisdom that guided Yeshua in his development of his halakha of spiritual reintegration. We're going to take a look at the Gospel of Thomas, the authentic Logion, number 7. Now, in this Logion, Yeshua compares the technique, one might call it the yoga, of suppressing the evil inclination to eating or swallowing. Paul, in his epistles, compared the process to crucifying the old nature, that is the first Adam, not Adam Kadmon, but the Adam that fell into incarnation, by removing the breath or life from it. In other words, don't let it express. And that is what this Logion, expresses. I'm going to show it to you. We have it only in Coptic, And this is not a technique, by the way, of psychological repression, where one uh, eventually no longer even knows what one is feeling or what one's motives are. Because if you repress, you become less and less sensitive to your own interior motives and so on. If you repress feeling, pretty soon you don't feel the feeling, any feeling. But it's not a technique of psychological repression. It's a technique of conscious suppression of negative desires or negative impulses, selfish desires, selfish impulses, as they arise into consciousness out of the heart, out of the center of your being. So here's what he said. Happy is the lion whom the man eats, for the lion will become man. But utterly destroyed is the man whom the lion eats, for the lion will become man. Wait a minute. The lion, in both cases, the lion becomes man. The Coptic says what I've translated here, and that's correct. Many translators of the Gospel of Thomas changed that last line, and the man will become lion. Destroyed is the man whom the lion eats, for the man will become lion. But it doesn't say that. And they justify it by saying, well, it must have meant that originally, because they don't understand it. But Yeshua used paradox, and he used hyperbole, and he liked this kind of a statement. Happy is the lion whom the man eats, for the lion will become man. That means that's a happy outcome. But utterly destroyed is the man whom the lion eats. He allows the lion to eat him, for the lion will become man. In this allegory, the lion is the force of rage and anger that arises from the Yetzer Hara in one's heart. Now, Yeshua didn't say that you should never express anger, and he certainly didn't say you should never know when you're feeling anger, but he did say you should not allow the anger to eat you up. It should not allow it to just rise higher than the throat to cause you to become a tool of that force. Now this reflects Yeshua's halakha, or the interior spirituality, or yoga, or tantra that he taught. It was practiced by Christian Egyptian desert fathers and mothers, and like Buddhist monks, they developed early Christian techniques of sanctification in the wilderness retreats that they were in the desert. They created special practices to focus the mind, such as weaving reed mats and then unweaving them to develop non-attachment. The early desert fathers and mothers preserved Jewish halakhic techniques from Yeshua known to the first generation of disciples, but not preserved in the proto-orthodox churches, except as an admiration for asceticism and ascetic things, and anti-sexual and an anti-marriage and a whole lot of other nasty things that were not taught by Yeshua. So here is the technique. You have to eat when you feel and you analyze your impulse, the spirit that's arising up in you, say a spirit of anger. Well, are you angry from the standpoint of a selfish response, or are you angry from the standpoint of a selfless response? When Yeshua saw injustice being done, he became angry, not because he was uncontrolled and he couldn't control his own anger, but there is a time for anger and there is a time for action. And that is what we call righteous wrath, righteous anger. That's different. But he's talking about when something arises from you that is, especially anger, that comes from your own feeling of personal insult or any other kind of feeling that's basically rooted in your own ego and in your own stake in your own selfish things, that should be controlled. And how do you do it? You swallow it. You don't let it arise any higher than the throat. That is what one of the old desert fathers said. Whenever anger rises up, he does not allow it to proceed any higher than the throat. In other words, he doesn't express it. He doesn't use his nasty words. Yeah, it was said that he never allowed anger to rise up beyond the throat. He swallowed it and sanctified himself. And that means that he recognized it, and he therefore controlled it. He repressed it. He tamed it. If the man eats the lion by refusing to empower his rising anger with evil words or deeds, that would be beyond the throat, then his lower animal nature is tamed and transformed and sanctified into that of the perfect humanity, the perfect man, the new Adam, the Baranash. And the lion becomes man. But if he is consumed and ruled by his lower nature, he can eventually lose his human soul. The lion becomes man. We have discussed that in an earlier presentation. So Yeshua characteristically employed paradox and hyperbole in his sayings, and that's why many of them have to be explained, or they seem to be paradoxical and so on. This was a technique of rabbinic and Jewish sages in their devarim. So for a $2 or more patronage per video presentation, if you decide to sponsor me, you will receive a PDF file of Incarnating the New Humanity, Practicing Yeshua's Lost Halakha for Spiritual Rebirth. This is a PDF file. I have it also as a book. I sell at workshops. And it's about the Halakha and how the Halakha is carried out. And it relates very much to what we have here in part 1 of this presentation about Yeshua's non-dual teachings. In part 2, which is coming next, we will examine the more advanced inner circle teachings on non-dualism and self-liberation that are found both hidden in plain sight in the New Testament writings as well as preserved in authentic Devarim and Mashalim found in the Gospel of Thomas. Please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the video to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. Thank you very much.